Our Bible story today is entitled The First Skyscraper. How long Noah and his family stayed on Mount Ararat, nobody knows. It is quite likely that they made it their home for a long time, using the ark as a storehouse for the food and seed they had brought with them. There was indeed nowhere else for them to live, not a house or a building of any kind. So here they stayed while Shem, Ham, and Japheth went exploring in the nearby valleys, looking for a good place to settle down and start farming again. At last, the day came when they decided to leave the ark and take all their belongings to their new home. As they started down the mountain, they must have looked back sadly many a time at the great ship that had meant so much for them, all for so many years, until at last it was hidden from view in the mist that covered the peak. Whether they ever returned to it, we do not know, or what became of it. Perhaps it was buried under the deep snow that later fell upon it and finally rotted away. The downward trek was difficult, for there was no road, of course, not even a trail of any kind. They had to clamber over jagged rocks, massive boulders, and fallen trees. In the hollows of the hills, they came across large bodies of water and vast areas of swampy land. Every step of the way, they saw fresh evidence of the awful destruction caused by the flood. Everywhere there seemed to be some fresh mark of the curse that sin had brought upon the world. But there was no time to be lost. They needed to build a new home and quickly, for there was a baby coming. The Bible says that Arphaxad was born 2 years after the flood. He was Shem's little boy and Noah's grandson. And when he was born, I am sure Noah was very proud of him. He is the first baby mentioned in the Bible as being born in the New World. But he was not the only baby born in those pioneering days. Many other babies were born after him. Shem, Ham, and Japheth all had very large families. Soon the first home they built wasn't large enough to hold them all, and they began to spread out. As the children grew up and got married, they too went off and started homes of their own. Thus, slowly at first, then more and more rapidly, the earth began to be repopulated. By the end of the first century after the flood, Noah's family had grown into hundreds of families and lots of children. There may well have been 500,000 people on the earth. One of the big questions all these people talked about was where to live. Should they divide up and go away to some distant, unexplored part of the world, or should they stay near home? Most of them decided they would rather keep together. Nobody wanted to go too far from great grandfather Noah, who, you will remember, lived for 350 years after the flood. Many times they must have talked about the beautiful world that Noah and his sons had known before the flood and how it was destroyed because of sin. What wonderful stories Noah could tell of those days. Nobody doubted the flood then. They were too close to it. And if anybody questioned whether the story of the ark was true, he could climb Mount Ararat and see for himself. One day, somebody raised the question: how do we know there will not be another flood that will drown us as our forefathers were drowned? But there's the rainbow, someone replied. When we see that, we are to remember God's promise that He will never again destroy the earth by a flood. But it isn't reasonable to trust our future and our children's future to rainbows, argued another. We should do something about it and make ourselves safe in case another flood comes. And so they said to one another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. The idea caught on, led by Nimrod, the mighty hunter. Everybody was soon helping to make bricks or carry them to the building site. Everybody, that is, except Noah and some others who remembered God's promises and trusted Him to keep them. To build a tower to reach above the clouds was a very great task and must have taken a long time and lots of hard labor. But gradually, it began to take shape. Week by week and month by month, the world's first skyscraper rose above the plain of Shinar. As it grew higher and higher, with long lines of people patiently carrying the bricks up the steep ramps, everybody felt pleased. Now they could build a large city around this tower and have a safe place of refuge should another flood come upon them. But God was not pleased. He does not like His word doubted any more than you and I do. The Bible says that the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. Of all the hundreds of busy builders, not one realized that God was so near. But He was right beside them. They thought they were getting along very nicely without Him. But they weren't, not really. It is never wise to forget God, for He sees and knows everything we do. And what did God think of the tower the people were building? Not much. Indeed, it must have seemed very small and paltry to Him who made the mountains, who raised up the mighty Himalayas of India, the lofty Alps of Switzerland, the high Andes of Chile and Peru, and the great Rockies of North America. What a pitiful little pile of earth it was after all. Yet it was dangerous. God saw that it would tend to hold the people in one place, whereas He wanted them to spread all over the earth. Then, too, if they all stayed together, not only would a great city grow up here, but an empire which, controlled by evil men, would thwart His gracious purpose for mankind. Something had to be done, and God chose a novel way to upset the program. He mixed up the builder's speech. In other words, He caused some to talk one language and some another so that they couldn't understand each other. The effect was amazing. Just imagine what would happen at school some morning if every child in your class suddenly began talking a different language. How far would teacher get with the lesson? And what sort of game could you play at recess? Everything would be one terrible muddle, wouldn't it? Most likely school would be closed and everyone sent home. And that's just what happened at the Tower of Babel. An overseer called for more bricks, and a man brought him mortar. Another called for a mortar and got a load of bricks. When a worker was told to bring the trowel, he brought a hammer. And when asked for a hammer, he brought a shovel, or just walked away, not knowing what was being said to him. Soon voices were raised in anger, and before long all were shouting at each other and striking each other until confusion reigned everywhere. Nobody could understand what had happened, and nobody knew what to do about it. One by one, people got disgusted and walked off the job. Work on the tower stopped. On their way home, some of them maybe went shopping, but they couldn't buy anything for the storekeepers couldn't understand what they wanted. Pretty soon, the whole place was an uproar. Then one man said to his wife, "This is terrible. Let's pack up and leave. I can't stand this any longer." So he gathered his belongings and his family, and perhaps a few others who could understand what he said, and went away. Soon another man did the same, and another and another. Little groups began moving off in all directions, until at last no one was left to go on building the tower. There must have been some very sad partings. Boys and girls who had played together tried to say goodbye and found they couldn't. Maybe they smiled and nodded and squeezed hands, but the words they tried to say sounded odd and ugly. Worse still, they couldn't plan to meet again. It was hard, but God was thinking only of their good, and they all needed to learn the lesson that it never pays to forget Him or disbelieve His promises.